I mean, for the most part, no. I mean, we're less than 16 millimeters thick. The framework laptop's actually, I think, 0.25 millimeters thicker than a 13-inch MacBook Pro, which is, totally not repairable or upgradable. And so we found that, we could shave off fractions of millimeters if we really sacrificed repairability and upgradability. But it was pretty obviously the right thing to do to actually just go and socket things and use fasteners instead of adhesives. And the actual form factor trade-offs are really not that dire, not even that significant. And so when we look at choices that other OEMs are making, it oftentimes comes down to a kind of cargo cult mentality. This idea that we do this because it's the way it's been done, or we do this because it's what we've seen other brands, often Apple do, without really thinking through, like, is this necessary? Is this actually the right thing to do? Is this what consumers even want out of the products that we're making?
Hey everybody, welcome back to What the Fix. I'm Jack Monahan.
And I'm Paul Roberts. This is our third episode of What the Fix. And as you know, every couple of weeks we're coming to you and talking about the latest news in the struggle for the right to repair. And Jack and I are going to go through the news of the week for you. And then we got a special interview coming up. So stay tuned. We got some really interesting stuff to talk about. Jack, before we get going, any housekeeping stuff we need to get out of the way?
Yeah, so this week is going to actually be a sneak peek for a fully premium episode. We're giving you just about 5 to 7 minutes of the interview, but if you want to see the whole thing, whether by video or audio, you're going to have to subscribe on our Substack, which will be linked in the episode description.
That's right. And, obviously subscribing supports the work that Jack and I do, and supports the conversation here around right to repair. It's getting to be a big issue. So as we've done in past issues, Jack and I are going to spend a couple minutes just going through some of the news highlights from the past couple weeks and talking about stories that matter, or at least matter to us. I'm going to start off this week, if that's okay with you, Jack.
Of course.
And the story I'm going to highlight is one that has to do with a lawsuit that the Software Freedom Conservancy brought against a smart television maker, Vizio. Some of you may have Vizio smart TVs in your living room, for violating the GNU General Public License, which is standard kind of open source license. It's not copyright. They actually call it copyleft. And it's a sort of a twist on copyright. And basically what it says is, under this license, you get all the rights to use this open source software. You can modify it, copy it, bend it to your own purposes, use it in your own products. The condition is that any derivative works from that, anything you create using this open source software, you then have to give back to the open source community. You have to make it available also under GNU public license and allow others to benefit from your work. And basically the lawsuit is Software Freedom Conservancy suing really on behalf of Vizio television owners to say that Vizio has not abided by that they used GPL software in basically the firmware that runs on their smart TVs, but have not given the derivative works back to the community. And Software Freedom Conservancy has sued on behalf of those users, saying basically, you need to give that back to us so that we can benefit from it, from the work that you've done as stipulated in this GPL. Vizio's fighting this, and they basically, the first kind of front in this battle, this legal battle, was for Vizio to try and move this from basically California State Superior Court to a federal court, and saying basically this isn't a contract dispute, this is really a copyright dispute, and therefore it needs to be handled in federal kind of copyright court. And basically they lost that argument. So a federal judge ruled last week that nope, basically the GNU public license is has aspects of copyright in it, but it is also a contract. it is not purely a copyright agreement. It is also a contract, and Vizio, it appears that you kind of contractually agreed to do this, and their, Software Freedom Conservancy is suing you for breach of that contract. And it's a really interesting case, and I think it's a really big case because, needless to say, Vizio is not the only device maker out there that is leveraging GPL software in their products and not giving the derivative works back to the public. And so this case, even though, as others have said, Kyle Wiens and others, is going to take years to litigate, as these often do, has huge implications for consumers, as well as obviously for device makers and for the open source community and for the sort of smart Internet of Things communities. One of the things I really think is interesting about this and worth following from the sort of right to repair standpoint is part of the argument that Software Freedom Conservancy is making is that when these companies don't return their derivative works basically to the public, what happens down the road when they decide to end of life or stop supporting these products is that the public is really left in the lurch, right? They don't have access to the software. They can't sort of pick it up and continue to maintain it, modify it, and to suit their own needs. That could include developing patches. And then one of the purposes of this copyleft license is to prevent that, to create this body of public software, basically open source software that the community can then maintain for the long term. And I think that's going to be a really important issue as the Internet of Things basically ages and more companies go the kind of Sonos speaker route. That was kind of the famous case of, just kind of end of lifing and bricking these smart products and leaving customers in the lurch. So this is kind of a canary in the coal mine for that whole conversation, and it's really interesting.
Yeah, I was so unfamiliar with copyleft. Like I had to Google it as soon as I saw it because I had no idea. But for me, it just boils down to people are on the hook for the user licenses that they agree to. Every time you hit agree, you're actually signing a contract essentially. And so it's accountability at the end of the day for companies that they are essentially creating a contract that they have to hold up to. And if this trend continues of them not, holding up their end, then what does that mean for consumers? Does that mean that, you get to buy, a product that when the software just stops being patched, you don't have the ability to fix it yourself. So you have to trash your TV. And that's just your TV. What happens when, device makers start making toasters and microwaves and ovens and cars? The implication,
which they already do, right? That future's upon us. That's right.
And so if you're using, open source software on a license like this, then the reality is there are a lot of stakes when it comes to the things that you own. It might just be a TV right now, but in case law, it means way more for, other appliances and things that you could possibly own.
Right, and Software Freedom Conservancy really is taking a sort of ecosystem and public health, I think a public health approach to this, which is the way you avoid that dystopian future where, as one kind of philosopher put it, everything's broken but nobody knows why, is to have this the software basically be in the public domain and allow the, hundreds of thousands of customers out there, users, to maintain it themselves when the company has decided, made a business decision basically to stop doing that, or gone out of business, right? They're just not even a going concern anymore. So yeah, super interesting case. Jack.
Well, this makes me think of all the things in my life that I actually don't know how to repair. But I will say the first thing I ever learned how to repair, wanted to repair, was an Xbox. When I was in middle school, I didn't have the money to, I'd gotten an Xbox. It was broken, and I was well, I got to fix this thing because I don't have the money to buy another one. So ended up doing that. But what I stumbled upon this past week was a story about a UK-based organization that's basically just kind of crowdsourcing, trading, and swapping games. And you can trade stuff from the 80s. Paul, there's pinball machines if you want that shipped overseas.
Oh man. Okay.
And arcade games. But yeah, so there's any range of stuff. But what I thought was interesting.
I'm a big pinball fanatic. That's why Jack said
Need to know.
Yes. Need to know. Big pin.
So what I thought was interesting was like a lot of times the stories that we're looking at and the stories that people are pushing about right to repair are really about like, technocratic solutions of like, oh, this expert decided that like, this is the right way to approach right to repair. Like, it's logistics this and technical that. But in reality, like a lot of this translates to like, what are people doing? What are they doing socially? Like, are they buying more things? This has to do with consumption and ultimately like community. And so I thought it was really interesting to see more communities popping up of, recycling, reusing stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that, in some ways the internet is perfect for this, right? Because it's easy to assemble, communities of, hundreds of thousands or millions of users from all over the place to share information and also, but just to trade stuff and exchange stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's, and gaming is obviously huge generator of potentially e-waste, right? How many gaming consoles are there in homes, and probably 3 or 4 generations of those gaming consoles, right? But they still have useful lives. They still have games that go with them, and like, yeah, I mean, it's a type of thing where there's a lot of potential there. Okay, my second story for our news roundup is the ongoing conversation about Apple and their self-service repair program. Apple is unmatched in its ability to generate dispute, conversation, debate, and this is a good example of it. So they announced their self-service repair program back in November. We didn't hear much about it, and then 2 or 3 weeks ago, they finally kind of pulled the covers off of it. And since then, there's been a lot of debate about, how real is this program? In some ways, they're making you buy parts and tools from them. It's OEM only, and et cetera, et cetera. But as Kyle Wiens pointed out, they're making service manuals available. They're doing a lot of stuff that previously they refused to do, which is all great. One of the big disputes this week, and it comes from an article The Verge did, talking about one part of this program, which is that if you want to, under the self-service repair program, you can order basically a mini Apple, iPhone repair shop, which they will send to you for, I think it's a $75 payment or something. And it's like an 80-pound box of just tools and battery presses and special suction cups and jigs and stuff. Kyle Wiens talked about this in our last Fight to Repair. In our last What the Fix podcast. And so there's a big sort of debate about whether this is a good thing or whether actually this is sort of overkill and maybe actually an effort to sort of dissuade people from doing self-repair. And so I know Louis Rossmann has weighed in on this, who is, sort of the Obi-Wan Kenobi of the right to repair movement in some ways. And sort of said, you got to give Apple a break. They're trying to do the right thing. They're trying to make it sort of dummy proof. They're giving you all the tools, perfect tools and equipment that you need to do the repair, even if you have no clue what you're doing, which is definitely true. And as Kyle said, like, wow, getting your hands on a lot of these tools, we've been trying to get our hands on these tools for a long time. So for them to ship them all to you is kind of special. I'm sort of torn on it. I think on the one hand, obviously it's a good development that Apple is enabling customers to repair their own devices. On the other hand, I do feel like the way they're doing this kind of plays into a larger narrative from the company that repair is something that is not easy, that requires very, very specialized tools and skills, and kind of like, don't try this at home. So the 80-pound box of tools that, you've got a week to make the repair. And if you don't get the tools back, headed back to Apple after that week, you're on the hook for $1,200 or $1,300 or whatever the replacement cost of all the tools is. That's a pretty... those are pretty big stakes for somebody who is maybe just looking to do a simple battery repair, screen repair, start button repair. Yes, they've got all the tools, but the, small print on this agreement to get this mini tool shop sent to you is such that you could certainly see it dissuading people. And I think the better message is probably the message that like groups like iFixit or companies like iFixit do, which is like, hey, repair isn't, it's something everyone can do. It's not big and scary and expensive. It's something that you can do with some simple parts and know-how. Watch this YouTube video, do it yourself. And I think that's sort of, as we want to make repair kind of more a part of just people's thinking, I think that's the attitude rather than like, well, if you want to repair, here's 80 pounds of tools and a $1,300 deposit, good luck. So that's my take on the tools. I think Apple being more hospitable to owner repair is good. And yet I think this part of their program is, reinforces a argument that is basically anti-repair that they've been making for a long time, which is only super experts should be doing.
I think they're doing two things at the same time. Because Kyle was saying on the last episode was essentially like, massive companies are like liability and compliance driven. They want to comply with laws. They don't want to get in trouble. So like they will do things ahead of laws coming out that they like, if they think that right to repair is inevitable, what they'll do is they'll set things up beforehand so they don't get into trouble. But at the same time, they're not going to actively promote a narrative that is like repair friendly. And so I think they're basically walking that line of like allowing it and like, saving their own hides, but at the same time, not trying to make repair, like more popular or seem more accessible. I haven't seen the video that Lewis put out, but I think just like for Kyle and Lewis, people that have been like fighting this. Yes.
But we will.
No, definitely. And I think that like they're probably so impressed because they've seen where Apple's been coming from. Like when you think about Kyle fixing that iBook back when he was in college versus now, like that's night and day. But I think the vision that we're trying to push for is like even further than that. So all about perspective.
Agreed. All right.
Yeah. The last story I have is about the legislations getting pushed through in the EU. And so the EU essentially has a period where they are reconciling laws between the EU Council and the actual Parliament. So I won't actually get into like how the EU governs itself.
Does anyone understand how the EU works? Like I don't. Every time there's like the European Commission, there's the European Parliament.
When you have that many countries, sort of like, it's a mess. But essentially, what it is there's two bodies that they're trying to reconcile, like language between laws. Like the EU Council is heads of state, and the EU Parliament are like people that are voted in, general elections and stuff.
Yeah. It's like their
specifically
legislature,
like
right?
EU legislators. So this is specifically a piece that was in Right to Repair Europe that was talking about, legislation about batteries. And what they're finding is like, and what I really pulled away from the article was just that like the nuances of like institutions writing laws really changes. Like you can have a vision for what you want Right to Repair to be, but it needs to meet the reality of like the laws and like the governing structures, and you need to be able to push laws through those structures and end up with like an end goal in mind. So like in this case they want to have replaceable and repairable batteries, but what they're finding is like some of the nuances of like how things move through committees or like how you reconcile language between these two bodies is pretty crazy, and like it ends up really messy. And so I think we see that when we're looking at bills dying in committee in in state houses. A lot of these ideas about Right to Repair, they're great. And like, I agree with a lot of them, but when the rubber meets the road and you actually need to create like tangible outcomes around Right to Repair, it has to get way less, conceptual and way more tactical about how you approach these things.
I also think that's why it argues in favor of not like narrowly scoping Right to Repair and just kind of creating sort of like the Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act, or something like that, of just sort of, creating the right broadly and then leaving it to, basically people to sort out, okay, if we need exceptions or whatever. Because, like, obviously, you can't have, we're about to see a Right to Repair wheelchair law in Colorado, which is wonderful. But let's be honest, there are, like, 10,000, 50,000 different types of products out there potentially that could have separate Right to Repair laws, and we're not going to pass a Right to Repair law for all of them, right? So it's a problem that's a broad problem that needs a broad consumer right. Um, and because, like you said, once you start trying to do things on a more narrow basis, like, well, let's just have a battery replacement
And the
law. All of a
nuances
sudden
of
it's like,
language,
well,
like just depending on how you define certain things, can have massive impacts on like, what counts
Right.
as replaceable, like what counts as like, easily accessible,
Right.
stuff like that. Like that can change, how many
Right.
batteries end
Right.
up in a landfill by like tens of hundreds of thousands. So, um,
That's right. That's right. So this came up as well in the United States recently, just with there was an effort by medical device manufacturers to try and push a change through Congress that was going to redefine remanufacturing, which is this term I wasn't even really that familiar with, but remanufacturing, basically kind of rebuilding medical devices to basically encompass most types of repair, right? And basically that failed because fortunately, repair advocates, medical repair proponents, and consumers groups got on it and said you can't do this because otherwise you're going to make most types of repairs illegal. But same exact thing, kind of subtle change to a definition in an obscure law that people don't pay that much attention to, but it can have a huge impact, out there in the marketplace.
yeah. And so this
right.
is really different from what we're actually going to be talking about today with Nirav, which is, he's kind of like a shining
Yes.
example of repair in the business community. And so they're a startup that is creating kind of this like super repairable laptop, very modular. And they launched this fall. We talked to Nirav this fall, and actually recently, I think it was this past week, they launched their kind of like second model of the framework laptop. And so we talked to him about a lot of stuff, the origin of the company, how venture capital works and all that around repair.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating interview. I mean, Nirav talks about sort of particularly the origin of framework, of going to VCs in Silicon Valley and the sort of, 2016, 2017 timeframe and say, hey, I want to do a startup. We're going to do a laptop startup. And people being like, dude, you're like 40 years too late. But being like, no, like new idea here. This is going to be different, And in fact, there is a market for this. And actually, obviously, succeeded in convincing people to fund his project. And now they've just come out with the second version of Framework Laptop just in the past couple of weeks. It's got some upgraded processor and hardware, but still same kind of modular design. So this is a conversation, just asterisk. We did this before the most recent release. But Nirav Patel, who is the founder and CEO of Framework Laptop, and really, really interesting conversation. Check it out. We're so happy to have you on. As the co-founder and CEO of Framework. For our viewers and listeners who aren't familiar, tell us a little bit about what Framework is and what you guys do.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Paul. Great to chat with you. So at Framework, we're really trying to remake consumer electronics and to remake it in a model that is better for consumers and better for the environment. And really the core of that is basically respecting people and the planet by making products that are designed to last. And critically by doing that, by making them repairable and upgradable and customizable by the end user to allow them to use it for as long as they'd like to.
And you just came out with your first product, which is a 13-inch laptop. Tell us about that.
Yeah, sure. So we just launched the Framework laptop earlier this year. I'm calling you from one, but here's just an example of one as well. But it's a thin and light 13.5-inch notebook. It's high performance using Intel's latest CPUs, and really from a couple of feet away, it looks and feels and behaves like any other premium notebook. It's does all the things that you'd normally expect a notebook to do. But then when you need to, you can get inside of it and replace every part and every module using a single screwdriver that we actually include in the box with every laptop.
And this is one of those things, like laptops are just everyday objects that, I think most of us sort of take for granted, and yet are incredibly, complex to actually manufacture and produce, as I'm sure you realize. From a design perspective, what is involved in kind of not only manufacturing a laptop, a consumer laptop, but going a step further, which you did in really making it sustainable, modular, repairable. Like what was involved in that? Did you start from the basis of existing consumer laptops and kind of work around that, or did you really kind of start from a clean slate in terms of this, in terms of the framework?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it helps a lot that laptops are just such a mature industry. The designs and architectures have largely stabilized over the course of the last, decade or 15 years, where,
Mm-hmm.
if you laid out a bunch of laptops from different brands and different years on a table, most consumers wouldn't be able to tell you what the brand was or what, chronological order they come in. And then that's,
Yeah.
that's sort of helpful for us. It means that um, we don't have to sort of make guesses as to what notebooks are or what they're going to be in the next few years. We more or less know they're going to be pretty similar to the notebooks that exist today. Um, and just coming from a background where my previous role, I was at Oculus architecting VR headsets, and that was obviously quite different, where we had to start from a blank slate and sort of reset the design and architecture because we were advancing the technology so much. So from that perspective, it was almost refreshingly straightforward to take this very mature category in notebooks and be able to build it in a way that is more upgradable and more repairable than the existing products. And, I'd love to say it was like this, an enormous mountain of design and engineering and architectural challenges we had to work through to make it, make it easy to repair. But actually, it's surprisingly straightforward. It makes it, that much more shameful, I guess, that so many consumer electronics products, even notebooks, are not designed in a way that they are repairable.
When we're talking about repairable, uh, what does that mean functionally? Like if everybody's familiar with a laptop they've got probably sitting in front of them. From a design perspective, what is it? What does it being repairable really mean? And could they tell by looking at it? I guess that it's a more repairable device.
Definitely. I mean, I'd say there's sort of a handful of things that all go together. I mean, most critically, actually, is just having access as an individual consumer to replacement parts and upgrade parts, where, instead of needing to, go dig deep into the gray market or find, potentially used parts of questionable origin, that you can actually get original quality parts directly from the brand, in our case, Framework, of course, to be able to do that repair if you ever need to, or do that upgrade if you ever need to. So that's sort of like the table stakes, making that available. But then beyond that, we want to make it easy. We don't want to just make it available. And so some things that we've done is make sure to use fasteners instead of adhesives wherever possible. We've actually labeled everything inside of the notebook with a QR code and
Yeah.
the name of the module, which is really helpful if you're especially if you're someone who's never been inside of a consumer electronics product before. Being able to just take your phone out and scan a QR code and be able to get a pointer to step-by-step replacement guide, information on how to recycle it, information on where to get an upgrade or replacement version, or even being able to resell a part that you're taking out and don't need anymore.
And framework is managing that whole supply chain, as it were, that whole market for parts and so on, and modules to add on to this. That's part of the overall business model.
Yeah, that's right. So we're setting up a marketplace. And the idea behind that actually is that we don't want it to just be us as Framework building and delivering these modules to the people using Framework laptops. We actually want to engage third party makers and sellers to be able to make that ecosystem of parts and replacement parts, richer and more available to everyone. And so,
Mm-hmm.
just as an example, our expansion card system, where all of the ports on the machine are actually these user selectable and swappable expansion cards, is a system that we've released as an open source design, and we're already seeing quite a few interesting community developed or small business developed designs that's going to just help enrich in that ecosystem.
Very cool. And I want to talk about those expansion ports because that is a really interesting feature of the device. So I know OEMs often, and let's just throw out one like Microsoft, often kind of couch um, some of their anti-repair features, like gluing their devices together, um, or having non-replaceable batteries, for example, as being driven by consumer demand. Like, well, consumers want really thin devices, and if you want it to be really thin, then you can't replace the battery, or we've got to glue it together. We can't use screws. Um, Was that your experience designing this? Again, either consumers are driving you in a certain direction, or that there are, that you have to make choices between design and repairability.
I mean, for the most part, no. I mean, we're less than 16 millimeters thick. The framework laptop's actually, I think, 0.25 millimeters thicker than a 13-inch MacBook Pro, which is, totally not repairable or upgradable. And so we found that, we could shave off fractions of millimeters if we really sacrificed repairability and upgradability. But it was pretty obviously the right thing to do, to actually just go and socket things and use fasteners instead of adhesives. And the actual form factor trade-offs are really not that dire, not even that significant. And so when we look at choices that other OEMs are making, it oftentimes comes down to a kind of cargo cult mentality. This idea that we do this because it's the way it's been done, or we do this because it's what we've seen other brands, often Apple, do, without really thinking through, like, is this necessary? Is this actually the right thing to do? Is this what consumers even want out of the products that we're making?
So you mentioned you were at Oculus before you started Framework. What got you interested in this concept of having a repairable laptop? Obviously, a laptop, Oculus, cutting edge consumer electronic, 3D vision. Laptops pretty much a commodity. So what turned you on to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, ultimately, it comes down to the idea of consumer ownership. The idea that when you pick up something like a laptop, this very advanced, important product in your life, that you should be able to do what you'd like with it. It shouldn't be something that you're basically borrowing from a manufacturer on the way to the landfill. And so it was really that, like, the core of this was the idea that it just feels obvious, but that when we have, as a consumer, pick up a product like this, we should be able to upgrade it and repair it and customize it and make it do what we like it to do, rather than only what the company that made it intended for it to do. And on top of that, over the last few years, especially, I've become increasingly aware, I think we've all become increasingly aware of the impact of e-waste and basically the environmental impact of consumer electronics and manufacturing as a whole. And the single best thing that we can do to help resolve that is make products last longer. So you need to make and dispose of fewer of them.
So Jason Calacanis interviewed you on his video podcast, and he made a statement which I don't know a lot about the VC industry, but just sounded true to me, which is, going to a VC in 2020 or 2021 and saying, I want money to build a consumer laptop, is probably a good way to get, like, your thrown out of thrown out of their office. It might be a hard sell, to put it that way. It kind of had the ring of truth to me. So was that your experience, and how were you able to get? Obviously, making a laptop requires a tremendous amount of capital up front. How were you able to get investors to buy into this vision?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, oftentimes venture capitalists like to say that they're, sort of ahead of the curve and pointing the world in the direction that it should be going in. But, that's probably not true very often. In most cases, people, are stuck, due to the requirements of their LPs or the other partners at their firm, to really be fairly conservative and really think about, like, do I want to take a bet that has failed for us or failed for someone else in the past? And so for us as Framework, as a new consumer electronics brand, we're sort of in 2021 where we are today, in the shadow of all these very high profile failures like, Essential and Juicero and all these other companies. And so just as a category, consumer electronics is very challenging. But the thing that helps us a lot is that it's very, very obvious that there is consumer demand for this. We see it every day when we, look at our order numbers or look at the interest from people who, are reviewing the laptop or talking about the laptop as a consumer. And so being able to show actual consumer traction, of course, is the thing that ultimately, venture capital or other investment sources want to see. So from that perspective, the bootstrapping stage of, like, getting from zero new company to being able to launch an extremely complex and fairly expensive product is, of course, challenging. But we've done that, and now it's a matter of proving the consumer traction, which we're also doing.
And in a design standpoint, I mean, how much of this was just finding was there a lot of software development that needed to happen to support this modular system, or was it really just kind of finding the right design and the right component parts in the supply chain and bring them all together?
Yeah, I mean, it's really a lot of industrial design and electrical architecture work sort of hand in hand, coming up with the right way to make things modular.
I don't know about
And then on
either of
top of
those two
that,
topics, so.
yeah, and then we're doing some interesting things in firmware to also just make upgradability and repairability easy. But in general, because notebooks are such a mature category, we do get to go into the supply base and pick all 5 companies that make all of the notebook batteries in the world, or all the notebook displays or keyboards and so on, and talk to all of them and tell our story and our mission and our philosophy, and find the one that is the most technically competent and the most excited to actually go and try to address these issues with us. And so we've
And
got
were
a
they
great set of partners.
were they receptive to that story when you went out and kind of pitched it to them?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, like everyone else, kind of going back to that cargo cult mentality challenge, the initial reception, initial response was like, is that actually possible? I mean, no one's done it that way. Like, surely you can't actually make it that thin. I mean, well it's going to be, an inch thick. But step by step, we'd go and like talk through, okay, what are the actual design challenges? What about, this idea or this other one? And we achieved really actually the almost exact spec that we set out a year and a half ago when we started the company.
Really cool. So companies like Dell and HP, if you kind of look at the spectrum of like hostile to repair, pro repair, I often see like, Dell and HP as, kind of more in the pro repair end of the spectrum, in that they do make replacement parts available. They do sell service manuals with their stuff. And, as opposed to, Apple or something, who's like, if you even open our laptop, you're violating our intellectual property, um, but I'd be interested in your thoughts. Is that kind of a misconception? In other words, even though they make replacement parts available, even though they make service manuals and documentation available and diagnostic software, which is all great, are there ways in which, in designing their laptops, let's say, actually they are kind of reproducing, anti-repair, anti-patterns, I guess?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think to a large extent, when you look at Dell or HP or Lenovo, they're driven by the needs of the most demanding customers they have, which are really their big enterprise customers. The companies buying,
Government, right?
yeah, buying 10,000 or 20,000 ThinkPads or XPSs or Precisions a year. And oftentimes when they have their RFQ processes, it's show us your repair manual, show us your parts catalogs. But it's in many cases it's available to those large organizations in a way that it's not quite available to an individual consumer trying to buy an individual replacement part. And it's also not necessarily the case that that especially for a consumer perspective, that these companies are being proactive about thinking about longevity. They're really thinking about, how do I satisfy the RFQs or satisfy what Best Buy or Amazon needs from me when I put this out in market.
So let's talk about these replaceable bays for the IO ports, and really interesting concept. I think all of us have had the experience of having to sort of twist cords around our laptops and like tug at cords because the port's on the wrong side of the device. And in the framework laptop, these are really swappable. You can take them out on one side, put them in the other side. You can configure the ports really any way you want with these little plugins. Talk about that design decision and kind of what informed that, and what types of ports you can choose from.
Yeah, I mean, so it was sort of obvious from the outset that every consumer has a different set of needs when it comes to ports. Like, I'm sure you have a different set of ports that you need than I need. It's just sort of inherent in that we are all just using our products in different ways. And yet every single laptop has a set of ports that's fixed in place by the team that designed it. And it just felt like a very, very low hanging, obvious improvement that we could make. Both to just generally improve the usability of the product, but also to really focus on that longevity. That if someone has a new peripheral that they want to use with their product, it shouldn't mean that they need to have this, bizarre set of contraptions on the outside of their machine just to get that thing working. They should be able to adjust their machine and be able to plug in exactly the device that they want.
Right. Yeah, those $30 contraptions that you find you need almost immediately upon taking your thing out of the box. So in the PC laptop space, like there are many different niches, right? So, if you're a gamer, there's the whole, Alienware box and other stuff that are really, specific to gamers. I guess one question would be, how does Framework avoid becoming a niche product, either for folks who are like, the small segment of laptop owners who are DIY people, or for the same people who are buying the like, no plastic bottles cleaning service, subscription that, is getting delivered to their house. I mean,
Sure,
it's
yeah.
great. And yet it's a really small, segment of the overall buying population. So how do you avoid that destiny?
Right. Yeah, I think that the two things that we really focused on there are one, making sure that it's just a great product that, really doing that side by side comparison against very popular notebooks like a Dell XPS or an HP Spectre or a ThinkPad, that the product stacks up well. And we believe we've done well there, and our reviews kind of show that.
They sure do.
And the
Yeah,
other
you get
part,
great reviews.
yeah, and the other part of it is really that we're solving a very familiar problem. Every single consumer has had this experience of a device that's pretty functional, but has, a screen that they cracked, or their battery's wearing out, or they've run out of storage space and they get stuck. And we've all, got our drawer of shame of dead devices that are just sitting there waiting for a disposal. So from that perspective, we think, that the problem is very real and it's very obvious to consumers, and it's just that sort of moment of it clicking and being, having people sort of understand and suddenly be aware that like actually there is a solution for this. It doesn't actually have to be that if you've got a worn out battery, you have to go buy a whole new phone or a laptop, or you crack your screen, or you're stuck. It is actually the case that these products are repairable if they're designed to be from the beginning. And so, we think we've got a really great path ahead of us to be able to tell that story and for it to resonate.
Have you, obviously, the Biden administration has come out in a very kind of outspoken way, supporting right to repair and calling on, the FTC and others to promote this notion of repairability. Has that changed things for Framework out there, talking to whether it's, big box retailers or other vendors about your product?
I think we just align, happen to align perfectly in terms of the FTC announcements around right to repair and Biden
Yeah.
administration announcements actually happening exactly the week that we started shipping the product, which we couldn't have timed that better. But it has just made the whole story around what we're doing that much more compelling, and that, people are awakening to the need for right to repair and the challenges around e-waste, and immediately in front of them seeing, oh, there's actually a company here or a set of companies in different categories that are trying to address this problem.
So, talk about how it's been since the launch, and how you're doing, and what your goals are going forward.
Yeah, so we've been doing incredibly well with the launch. We're very happy with the response and the sales throughput. We're selling them as quickly as we can make them, and we're continuing to try to scale up our manufacturing to make more as quickly as we can. And so from here, we're in the U.S. and Canada. We know that right to repair and concerns about e-waste are a major concern in Europe as well. That's somewhere that especially in France with their repairability score that they just launched, but also the rest of the EU and UK. That's an area that we're going to be launching into soon. We're also launching into a lot of the major markets in East Asia, where similarly have pretty serious programs around e-waste and reducing environmental harm. And we, of course, are continuing to expand our ecosystem around the Framework laptop. Additional expansion cards, future other modules to make available.
You think of moving beyond the laptop to other types of devices?
Yeah, I mean, the problems that we're solving here really apply to almost any part of consumer electronics. Or, you can look at any of the devices around you and see the same problems repeated just about everywhere. And so the opportunity certainly exists. And for us, it's really a question of sequencing in a way that makes sense.
Do you feel like one of the things that could change the dynamics would be some, kind of governments, whether it's a U.S. government, Canadian government, EU, not stepping into the market, but maybe pricing in, the environmental cost of disposable electronics in a way that changed buyer behavior?
I do think so. I think there are ways to for regulations to really help consumers, especially make good decisions. And I think
Yeah.
what is happening in France is actually a great example of this. Having a 0 to 10 score similar to iFixit's repairability score, right next to the price tag of every laptop and smartphone and a few other categories, and consumers can see right there, like, here's 2 or 3 different notebooks, they all look interesting, and this one's got 5 out of 10 and this one's got a 9 out of 10. I think I'll get the more repairable one.
Yeah. Because that cost of repairability or lack thereof is really kind of secretly could be the most
Right.
significant, feature that you need to consider as a buyer, right? Whether one
Absolutely. Yeah.
one component breaking means the end of this device or not. Um, Final question for viewers, listeners: how can they own one of these? What do they need to do?
Sure. Yeah. You can go to frame.work, and our pre orders are currently open in the US and Canada. If you're outside of the US and Canada, you can drop in your email address and we'll shoot you a note as soon as we launch in your country.
Nirav, is there anything I didn't ask you that I should have?
That's a good question. I mean, I guess one question that we often get is, are we worried about Dell or HP or Lenovo trying to do the same thing and come after us? And I think for that, it's really a rising tide lifts all ships kind of scenario. We would love to see bigger companies embrace the right to repair in a serious way. We believe that our focus, in addition to repair, on being able to upgrade and customize deeply, still resonates well with consumers. And of course, that's also just what we want to see. We want to see, less e-waste piling up around the world. So we'd love to see more big companies jump in.
I totally agree, and it's so great talking to you. And thank you so much for doing this. I mean, I know it's not purely altruistic, but I mean, I think a really important product and a really important trend in consumer electronics. So, Nirav Patel, Framework, thank you so much for coming in and speaking to us, and thanks for everything that you do.